the main thing that this legislation does is codify, basically make permanent all these tax cuts that were issued in 2017 as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, better known as the Trump tax cuts or the Republican tax cuts. All this big tranche of tax cuts were all coming to expire. I think somewhere in the range of 60 to 70% of taxpayers would actually see their taxes go up next year.
Welcome to Deep Dive. Here at the Washington Examiner, we dig deep into what's happening behind the scenes in the nation's capital. And this week we have someone who's in the trenches to give us clear insight. Washington Examiner's Zach Halaschak, economics reporter, has been reporting on the big, beautiful bill passage. We'll dive into specifics of what's in it and what's not, who are the winners and who are the losers, and when voters can expect to see tax relief, and what happens now that the bill has taken effect. For more, we turn to Zach. Well, welcome to the show, Zach. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been following the One Big Beautiful Bill Act closely. As the name implies, it's very large. Can you give us a quick overview of what this bill does?
Yeah, it does a lot of things, but the main thing that this legislation does is codify, basically make permanent all these tax cuts that were issued in 2017 as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, better known as the Trump tax cuts or the Republican tax cuts. This big tranche of tax cuts were all coming to expire at the end of this year. So unless something was done, I think somewhere in the range of 60 to 70% of taxpayers would actually see their taxes go up next year. So that's the main thing that this does. The biggest chunk of this legislation is makes these individual tax cuts permanent for like individual income rates. And then it also does some other tax changes that were part of President Trump's campaign agenda. No, he campaigned on no taxes on tips. He campaigned on eliminating taxes for overtime wages, no Social Security taxes, that sort of thing. So what this legislation does is takes all these tax cuts that came in his first term, continues those, extends them out, makes them permanent, and also includes all these other tax provisions that he sort of campaigned on this time around. And some of those tax provisions are a little more niche. They cater to one subset of workers. Obviously, the amount of tipped wage workers is a pretty small population when it comes to the overall US. But all these kind of tax changes are included in that. And then there are also other things that are kind of outside of that tax space. So it provides a lot of money for border wall funding. It provides money for deportations of illegal immigrants. It also does things that are kind of popular with fiscal conservatives. So cut spending in Medicaid, cut spending on the SNAP program or food stamps. And it does kind of cut spending more specifically in those programs by applying work requirements to those. So it sort of has this very broad appeal for different subsects of, the Republican Party. You have the fiscal hawks have some things that they like. You have the populists, some things they like, for instance, a bigger child tax credit. And then you have some things that the traditional Republican base likes, or the supply siders within the party like, which are basically like the business tax provisions, full expensing, R&D, that sort of thing. So it's a very pretty broad package. I don't think it's much of a stretch to call it, the big part of it, the beautiful bill. We'll see how it all shakes out in the coming months as this tax policy start to be implemented.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see how it goes. And this bill seems to have winners and losers. Your reporting highlights the SALT caucus, Trump, and businesses as winners. Can you elaborate on why they benefit specifically and what changes in the bill led to those wins?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the biggest winners of this entire, multi-month process of coming up with this reconciliation legislation were the SALT caucus. And SALT stands for state and local tax deductions. In 2017, as part of that TCJA, that Trump tax cuts package, the original one, there was a $10,000 cap put on how much you could deduct from your state and local taxes. That really only affects high tax states like New York and California. And really, in those states, it's mostly Democratic lawmakers. So there's a very small sect of the Republican Party that are in these, blue states, high tax blue states, but are Republicans. But because the majority was so slim in the House this time around, this group of maybe 4 to 6 lawmakers could just say, we're not going to vote for this package at all unless we get what we want, which is a bigger SALT cap. I know that some of the lawmakers in the SALT caucus were really, punching for like $100,000 SALT cap. Everyone kind of knew that was untenable. It would cost way too much in the context of the package, and it only really affects a small subsect of the conference, the Republican conference. But at the end of the day, they were actually able to negotiate it up to $40,000. So they quadrupled the SALT cap, which is a huge win, especially considering there was not a single Republican senator who wanted to see that $10,000 cap raised. But they basically said, you know what, you're either going to get this bill or you're not. And they were able to dig in their heels and get, a quadruple of the SALT cap, which is a big win for them. And then I had mentioned earlier the business tax provisions, but those are a big win. Originally, the House, so how this works in reconciliation, the House passes its version of the legislation, then the Senate passes its version of the legislation, which might include changes from the House's version. And then, the House votes on the overall Senate legislation and, sends to the president's desk. Well, when the House originally passed this, they had all these business tax provisions that were, are objectively the most pro-growth provisions in the legislation, but they were only extended out several years. They weren't made permanent. When it came over to the Senate, you had senators. I just interviewed Senator Lankford from Oklahoma recently. He was the one really pushing behind the scenes for this. Senator Crapo from Idaho is another major proponent of the business tax provisions, but they wanted to make these permanent. They wanted these to be long-term drivers of economic growth. And, just speaking to some of them after the bill passed and the fact that this was kept in there, it seems like a big win for them. They think it's going to be the biggest boost for GDP that comes from the legislation. Because again, a lot of these individual tax provisions that were put in here, they were just extending what already was in the law. So, there wasn't expected to be a huge pop in growth driven from those just being extended out the same way. So these business tax provisions, which provide companies with more certainty, makes companies able to invest more smartly and kind of expand their companies and make more jobs, is going to be the most growth centric portion of the legislation. So those were also big winners in the legislation.
And on the flip side, you've identified deficit hawks, like you mentioned earlier, colleges, universities, and some family support advocates as potential losers. What aspects of the bill negatively impact these groups?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take one that you mentioned, colleges and universities. Obviously, if you've been following politics in recent years, Republicans have kind of taken a very critical eye toward colleges and universities, especially in the fallout of the Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent anti-Semitic protests and, some of the things that have come out of these colleges. Republicans have looked for different ways to kind of dig into these. They accuse the colleges of being hyper liberal or indoctrinizing students, that sort of thing. Obviously, Democrats push back on that assertion. There's a big push to get some sort of punitive measure put in the legislation, reconciliation legislation, and that came in the form of an excise tax. So there was an excise tax already on the books for these major colleges, universities like Harvard, the ones with the biggest multi-billion-dollar endowments. But the House version of legislation, which passed first, actually jacked that level, that highest rate for the biggest universities up to 21%, which is just a massive amount compared to what it was before that. But then when it came to the Senate side, that got watered down a bit. I believe the top rate is 8% now, but still that's a major loss for these big universities because they're going to have to find a way to recoup those losses and revenue, and they're going to have to pay the government more for that. So colleges, universities, not happy with that. I would also say the deficit hawks, as we mentioned, the Chip Roys or the Thomas Masseys of the world, they were kind of, left high and dry with this. Chip Roy voted for the legislation. Other members that originally objected to it because it didn't contain enough of spending cuts ultimately did vote for the legislation. But I think they kind of did so after, hours and hours of backroom calls, Trump calling, encouraging them, a lot of kind of unspoken deals that there will be even more cuts down the line. But I don't think they were satisfied fully with the level of spending cuts that were in this massive legislation. But it was a tricky proposition for Republican leadership because if they cut too much, and did the wishes of the deficit hawks, then they would have start run into the moderates who are saying, we don't want more cuts. We actually want to go the other way. So it's kind of this like tug of war going on in the Republican Party, both in the House and in the Senate in the weeks leading up to final passage. So there were also some folks that, didn't end up getting out of there too happy.
Yes, certainly hard to please everyone, that's for sure. And the bill makes some tax cuts from 2017 permanent, but it also adds new provisions. Which of the new provisions do you think will have the most significant impact on average Americans?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the ones that might be felt most immediately, or at least next year when people file taxes and do all that, is if you're a worker, a tip worker, or something like that, you're experiencing it. you'll experience those tax changes. But I don't think the average taxpayer who, maybe works a 9 to 5 job, salaried job, is really going to experience much out the gate because there isn't really tax cuts for them. Again, this big part of this package was extending those out. But I do think that if Republicans are correct and that this does spur on growth because of the business tax provisions, and just because of the certainty that comes with it. Again, if this weren't passed, if there weren't some form of tax package passed this year, then most people's taxes would go up. And, a lot of lawmakers I talked to, an economist, said that would basically cause a recession because the stock market would freak out so much. But I think in the longer term, the average taxpayer is going to see some improvement in the economy or economic growth. At least that's kind of what Republicans surmise. So that might be something, they might see the stock market performing better. Depends, a year or two from now, if there's more investment in business, maybe companies hiring more. So I think some of the more pronounced effects might take longer to sort out. But if you're a worker who is like in these very specific groups, like a tipped worker or someone who makes a lot on overtime pay, or even a Social Security recipient, I think you're going to start seeing those effects much quicker.
And there are conflicting reports about the bill's impact on the national debt. The CBO says it'll add trillions to the deficit, while the White House claims it'll reduce it through growth. What's your assessment, and how did you navigate these competing claims in your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of difficult. You have a lot of outside groups, like uh, all these think tanks are coming up with these numbers. And I would say the majority of the third party groups, like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, University of Pennsylvania puts out their Wharton model. Most of those shows that this will add to the deficit. I think that the CBO itself, which is Congress's in-house scorekeeper, said it would be a 3.3 trillion deficit hit over 10 years. But then you have the White House, the Council of Economic Advisors, saying that this will actually reduce the deficit by spurring so much growth that it sort of makes up for those losses. It's really difficult to kind of gauge these things because we're in the moment now. Past precedent has shown CBO numbers have been off. And at other times they haven't been. And so I think when reporting on this and kind of navigating it, it's important just to include as many different sources as you can. And I tried to do that with the CEA estimates, the CBO estimates, the outside third party group estimates. But I think it's kind of hard to really definitively say what exactly this is going to look like in terms of spending and in terms of how much it's going to add to the deficit or even subtract from the deficit until we're really there a year or two from now and can look back in retrospect and kind of take a long view of what happened.
Sure. And your article suggests a shift in the Republican Party away from traditional supply side economics towards a more populist approach. How did you observe this shift during the bill's development and negotiation?
Yeah, I mean, typical Republican orthodoxy is, lowering rates for as broad of a base as you possibly can. So for as many people as possible and getting them low to spur economic growth and incentivize job creation, that sort of thing. And again, we've talked about this, these sort of more niche tax changes, to tipped workers or to overtime pay, they only affect small pools of taxpayers, and they don't really, they spend money because we're losing revenue by cutting taxes, but they don't really do it for a broad subsection of society. And again, we did see the business changes. That's something that traditional supply siders, I'm sure, have cheered, and I've talked to many who are happy about. But it didn't do anything with like the corporate rate, which was lowered in 2017 as part of TCJA. On the campaign trail, President Trump talked a little bit about the idea of lowering the corporate rate down to 15% or maybe 15%, but only for companies that manufacture domestically. We didn't see that push. That would have obviously cost more money and would have added to the concerns of deficit hawks. But still, you're seeing a mix of different tax policies here. And then when it comes to like things like the child tax credit, most supply siders traditionally in the Republican Party wouldn't want to see the child tax credit increase. They would want to, see that not be something, subsidies to families growing and government support of different groups increasing. But this time around, we saw the child tax credit increase from $2,000 to $2,200, which again is just a pretty modest increase. Actually, some conservative family populists are kind of disappointed that it didn't go even further. I was talking to Josh Hawley. He wishes there was a $5,000 tax credit. But again, there's a lot of changes in this bill that kind of appeal to the populists in the party. And we've seen the party kind of move in the past 6 to 10 years away from the traditional supply side orthodoxy where, corporate tax cuts are the big thing toward more of a populist slant. You have people like JD Vance and Hawley, as I mentioned, who are kind of leading the charge on that. And it's going to be interesting, I think, the next time around when Republicans try to pass tax policy, because it'll be curious to see if they kind of move back to that traditional orthodoxy or if they kind of try to stay in the line of this populist new wave that's kind of enveloped the party in recent years. So that's something to be seen come 2028, whoever ends up in the White House. But that's a big story of the party moving forward.
I know that there were a lot of late nights covering this. Did any surprising or unexpected information emerge during your reporting process that changed your initial understanding of the bill?
I think that's a good question. I would have to think about it a little bit, but just off the top of my head, I think something that surprised me quite a bit was after we had the House version, as I said, that passed. That took a long time to pass. I was there all night, and then it went to the Senate version, and that also took a long time to pass. They call it a votorama, so amendments are offered, that sort of thing. And I think went for close to like 30 hours, somewhere in there, of them constantly working on this to get it passed, and then finally, I believe it was 2:30 in the afternoon. So many hours after it started, that passed. But at the time when it passed the Senate, just a couple days before the 4th of July holiday, 24 House members who had signaled that they did not support the Senate version of the bill. And I was like, I remember thinking there's no way this thing could pass before the 4th of July. But shockingly, all those members really just folded in the end, whether it was pressure from Trump, assurances from House leadership that they would get something down the road. Just all these various reasons within just 24 hours or so, the bill was passed. And that was a huge win for House Speaker Mike Johnson. And I think it's a testament to like kind of how good he's running the conference to some degree. Because a lot of reporters and a lot of lawmakers even I talked to are kind of surprised that it was able to pass by that self-imposed July 4th deadline. Because again, this wasn't a hard deadline. Nothing would have happened if they didn't pass it on by the 4th of July. But they really had the whole landing strip the entire year to do this. Although they had some debt ceiling stuff and they could have stripped that out. But it was pretty impressive to me that they were able to come together and pass that so quickly after the Senate finally kind of pushed it through the finish line there.
Yeah, certainly. And I know you said that it's going to take time to see all the effects of the bill. So looking ahead, what are the key questions or uncertainties that you'll be following as this bill is implemented and its impact becomes clearer?
Yeah, I think like some of the questions remain on implementation, kind of in the weeds stuff. Like for instance, if you're going to exempt taxes for tipped workers, would that then encourage salaried workers to maybe, or like companies that employ salaried workers to move that to a tip model to incentivize workers to join their company? And then how does that create a distortion in the tax code, that sort of thing? I think that a lot of these kind of more in the weeds issues on implementation are something I'm going to be following up on a lot. And then there's just another question of, you've already heard some lawmakers suggest there might be another reconciliation bill or even two reconciliation bills down the line. I think it's pretty early to start speculating on that. And, while there's some hopes among the Republican Party that'll happen, I think that the big question now is, well, what tax policy do you want to get changed at this point? I think they pretty much had a chance to do it in this package and did as much as they could get passed into law. But we'll see in the coming months what ends up shaking out.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Zach. It's clear the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is a complex piece of legislation, and we appreciate your time and expertise on the matter.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for watching Deep Dive. Please visit our website for more of these investigations, and feel free to send us your questions or story ideas. We hope to see you back here next week.